Good morning. As President of the Geochemical Society, it's my privilege today to introduce the 2023 Frank Wigglesworth Clarke Award, which honors a single outstanding contribution to geochemistry or cosmochemistry by an early career scientist. This year's recipient is Sarah Ahrens of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. And to present the citation, I'd like to invite John Higgins from Princeton University. John?
So on behalf of the nomination committee, it is a pleasure to present the award, or present the citation for Professor Sarah Ahrens for the F.W. Clarke Award at this year's Goldschmidt Conference. Sarah was nominated by her peers for her pioneering research applying radiogenic and non-traditional stable isotopes to better understand the Earth, its history, and our place on it. Sarah's science is remarkable in both its breadth and depth, spanning just about the entire field of geochemistry. Paper titles on her impressive CV jump from the origins of continental crust at the Hadean-Archean boundary to the effects of regional drought in the Sierra Nevada and California on dust microbiomes, to ab initio calculations of titanium isotope fractionation, to Antarctic ice core records of dust and climate. She could give a keynote at just about any Goldschmidt session. Sarah received her PhD in geology in 2016 with Dr. Sarah Asiego at the University of Michigan for her dissertation entitled Evidence of Regional and Global Climate Change in Mineral Aerosol Dust Record from Ice Cores Through the Anthropocene and Pleistocene. This innovative and multidisciplinary research focused on understanding the role of dust in Earth's climate system and biogeochemical cycles using the archives afforded by high altitude and polar ice cores. It involved both technically challenging fieldwork, the development and refinement of geochemical techniques to measure the chemical and isotopic composition of ice core dust, and the ability to put it all together with an understanding of atmospheric circulation and dust transport to reconstruct changes in Earth's climate in critical regions. This work resulted in an astounding 11 peer-reviewed journal articles, 7 of which she first authored. Upon finishing her PhD, Sarah was awarded a prestigious UC Irvine Chancellor's postdoctoral fellowship, and during her short one-year appointment, decided to learn organic geochemistry and an entirely new and complex analytical technique and instrumentation for measuring vanillic acid as a paleofire indicator on the Eclipse ice core from Yukon, Canada. Sarah was then offered a Ford Foundation postdoctoral fellowship to work with Professor Nicholas Dauphin at the University of Chicago. There she focused on non-traditional stable isotopic geochemistry, and in a short 2-year time span tackled several scientific questions that greatly advanced our understanding of continental crust evolution and sediment transport. In particular, in a study published in Science Advances in 2020, Sarah used variations in the stable isotopes of titanium to investigate the origins and evolution of continental crust. Titanium isotopes are fractionated during magmatic differentiation, primarily because of differences in coordination between titanium and melted minerals. Lower coordination tends to be associated with stiffer bonds and stronger equilibrium isotope fractionation, such that equilibrium titanium oxides have light titanium isotopic compositions relative to the melts from which they crystallize. Titanium isotopes are therefore sensitive tracers of the onset of oxide crystallization in melts during magmatic differentiation. Prior studies had shown that magmatic differentiation under relatively dry conditions produces sharp, heavy titanium isotope enrichments in the magma, while magmatic differentiation with relatively hydrous magmas or partial melting of basaltic crust produces more subdued titanium isotope fractionation. Titanium isotopes can thus help us learn about the geological context of formation of a magmatic rock. In her breakthrough study, Professor Ahrens targeted samples from the Acasta gneiss and showed that the oldest samples fall on the tholeiitic dry magmatic differentiation series, while younger samples plot among calc-alkaline series rocks and TTGs. Professor Ahrens was thus able to demonstrate that there was a shift from tholeiitic to calc-alkaline style magmatism between 4.02 and 3.75 billion years in the Slave Craton. The 4.02 GA rocks could have formed by magmatic differentiation in a manner akin to Icelandites under the influence of a plume, while the later samples could have formed by recycling of hydrated mafic crust, leading to the production of TTGs and calc-alkaline series magmas, possibly consistent with an early onset of subduction. Since becoming an assistant professor at the University of California at San Diego in 2019, Sarah has established a thriving and productive research group that spans the breadths of her interests from igneous petrology to chemical oceanography to biogeochemistry and climate. These accomplishments have been recognized by a 2019 Kavli Fellowship at the National Academy of Sciences, and in 2021 she received the Doris M. Curtis Outstanding Woman in Science Award from the Geological Society of America. In addition to these remarkable scientific accomplishments and awards, Sarah also stands as an exemplary role model and mentor for young geoscientists, in particular indigenous students. As a native Alaskan, Inupiaq, Sarah has served as a volunteer instructor at the UC Irvine American Summer Institute in Earth System Science, an intensive 2-week residential program for Native American Alaska Native high school students. And in 2018, she was recognized as the National Center for American Indian Enterprise Development 40 Under 40 Award. In closing, Dr. Ahrens is a brilliant and creative scholar, a skilled field and laboratory scientist, a dedicated teacher and mentor, and a strong advocate for increasing diversity within the geosciences. She is an excellent choice for the 2023 F.W. Clarke Award.
Thank you. Thank you, John, for the really kind words and introducing the topic of the talk today. But first, I'd like to say that I'm incredibly honored and humbled to receive the F.W. Clarke Award from the Geochemical Society. First and foremost, I would like to thank my family for their support in my academic pursuits, even when they wondered why I was spending weeks out in the field collecting rocks or sleeping in a tent on a glacier in Antarctica. I would also like to thank everyone who nominated me for this award and anyone who has supported, inspired, or believed in me professionally. At Stanford, my introductory geology class at the end of my sophomore year, taught by Dr. Ann Egger, introduced me into the field and showed me that my love of science and interpreting figures could be even better by spending time outside and taking part in observations that could then be proven through measurements. She recommended me to work with Dr. Elizabeth Miller, where we spent a week in the Brooks Range in Alaska with my dad, collecting shales for uranium-lead detrital zircon geochronology. Without these formative experiences, I would not be in the place that I am today. I'm very grateful to my PhD advisor, Dr. Sarah Asiego, for seeing potential in me as a graduate student and taking a risk in accepting me. Thank you for teaching me how to be an isotope geochemist, instilling a healthy fear of contamination, and consistently drilling into me the importance of being an effective scientific communicator and writer. Thank you to Dr. Kathleen Johnson, Dr. Eric Saltzman, and Dr. Nicolas Dauphas for welcoming me into your labs for a critical transition from a PhD student to a postdoc. And to Nicolas, thank you for also taking a risk in mentoring someone with a different area of expertise and no experience in non-traditional stable isotopes. I'm grateful for the experience of learning a new technique and branching out, which has greatly influenced my current research interests and trajectory. I'd also like to thank Dr. John Higgins for supporting me through another career transition from postdoc to faculty, inviting me to be involved in projects and demonstrating that you can be a geochemist who works on rocks and ice cores. The field of isotope geochemistry is one of the least accessible and diverse subfields of the geosciences. Underlying this accessibility issue is the expensive nature of our research. Trace metal clean labs and mass spectrometers are extremely expensive, so our ability to conduct this research is limited by whether we have these facilities at our institutions or whether our advisors have close working relationships with those that do. Previous Clarke awardees have highlighted the barriers that exist in this field for women, women with children, people from historically excluded groups, and international students. While these barriers come in many shapes and forms, I'd like to use this opportunity to advocate for working with students, postdocs, and scientists from institutions that do not have the same resources as yours, to think deliberately about the diversity of your collaborations, your co-author list, and the language you use in writing reference letters and reviews. We now know of the gender gap that exists in common geoscience journals, which may be attributed to biases experienced at different stages of the publication process. So I'd also like to highlight the importance of questioning our own implicit bias in reviewing for academic journals. Lastly, I'd like to thank my best friend and partner Nick for all your love and support during this journey, and my son Cass for being the best thing to look forward to when I leave the lab. Thank you again for this incredible honor, which so many of my peers deserve as well. Okay, so with that, I'm going to jump into the science talk. All right, so today I'm going to be talking about titanium isotopes, and specifically whether we can unravel some of the processes responsible for early Earth crustal generation. Oh, sorry. All right, before I jump in, I'd like to acknowledge some of the funding sources that made this work possible, specifically the Ford Foundation and the UC Chancellor's Postdoc Fellowship, which supported that transition from PhD to postdoc. All of the people involved in the lab work, the data interpretation, and co-authors of the data and studies that I'm going to be talking about today, and also people in the Origins lab who helped with mass spectrometry, insight advice, and modeling help, including people at Scripps as well. Sorry. All right, so hopefully I don't have to justify to this audience, why plate subduction is important, but this question of plate subduction and the impact that it has for volatile and nutrient cycling has really large implications for Earth's habitability. So this question of when did plate subduction begin is an important one, and when did it become widespread? So subduction is the method through which we facilitate the exchange of wet crust, sediments, and seawater from Earth's surface into the interior. It's how we return carbonates into the mantle. The volcanism that happens from the subduction expels CO2 into the atmosphere, and the silicate weathering of this crust produced by subduction is what provides biologically limiting nutrients to the Earth's surface, thereby influencing the global carbon cycle and habitability through time. All right, so this is a hotly debated question. When did plate subduction actually start? Our estimates range from about 0.85 to more than 4 billion years ago. So this is a huge range of Earth's history. And the way that we try to pin down when this started is through preservation of modern plate tectonic features. So modern manifestations of plate tectonics like seafloor reversals, seafloor magnetic reversals are absent from a lot of Earth's geological record. So instead, as researchers, we have to rely on other indirect evidence to recognize the action of plate tectonics in the past. The actual process of plate subduction and generation of new crust is, it's recycling, right? And so we're actually destroying these remnants of crust that we'd like to use to prove that when it started. We can also look at detrital zircon age spectra, trace element and isotope geochemistry of detrital sediments, and we can also use model-based estimates to determine this. So I'm going to briefly, introduce titanium isotopes. So stable titanium, it has 5 isotopes ranging from 46 to 50. Titanium is a high field strength element. It has a very low solubility. It's a refractory element, and it's a lithophile, so it likes to be in rocks. And it's present as one oxidation state on Earth, so it should be unaffected by fluctuating redox conditions in the atmosphere and oceans. And for the rest of the talk, I'm going to be using per mil notation, which is the titanium 49/47 ratio of a sample relative to that of a standard. All right, so this is a figure from one of the first papers published about titanium isotopes in terrestrial rocks. And the first thing that you can notice is that, let me actually put the laser pointer on. No. The first thing that you can notice is that titanium isotope composition scales with silica content. So if, really primitive samples close to mantle compositions have titanium isotope compositions close to 0 per mil, And as we move towards more evolved compositions like granites, we have progressively heavier and heavier titanium isotope compositions. So as we proceed with magmatic differentiation, we reach heavy titanium isotope compositions. This was hypothesized to be due to the fractional crystallization of titanium-bearing oxides like ilmenite, for example, and this has to do with a change in the coordination environment of titanium. It's thought to be primarily 5-fold coordinated in melts. This changes to 6-fold coordination in iron and titanium oxides. So stable isotope theory tells us that heavy isotopes prefer these stronger bonds, and so the lighter isotopes are going to be preferentially incorporated into the iron and titanium-bearing oxides, leaving behind progressively heavier and heavier titanium isotope compositions. All right. A subsequent study used this relationship between titanium isotope composition and silica content in igneous rocks to try to probe the nature of Earth's crust through time, preserved in the detrital shale record throughout Earth's history. So shales are a sedimentary archive of what's been weathered off of the continents and preserved in shallow marine environments. So it's thought to be a really good proxy for the average upper continental crust composition. So here, if we're looking at this igneous rock trend, rocks that are very primitive, rich in magnesium and iron, should be close to 0 per mil. Rocks that are more involved, rich in silica and aluminum, have heavier titanium isotope compositions. So the idea here is that if you measure a shale and it's a heavy composition, it would reflect that you're weathering crust that's primarily felsic in composition. The data from this study is shown in this figure on the right. And so here on the x-axis, we have age going from about 3.5 billion years ago to present. Mafic and ultramafic rock compositions are highlighted as this green bar down here, close to 0 per mil. Average felsic rocks are closer to 0.4 per mil up here. And all of the shale data are shown as these colored circles. And the circles correspond to the number of measurements in that sample. So the idea is that if you saw some secular shift in the titanium isotope composition of these shales, it would indicate that something profound had happened in Earth's history during that time period. The first thing that you can notice is that all of the shales are elevated, so they're slightly heavy. On average, they're about 0.15 per mil, which suggests that they're more evolved than mafic and ultramafic rocks, right? And the other thing that you can notice is that there's a lot of variability here. And if you plot a regression line through this data, you can see that the titanium isotope composition of the detrital shale record hasn't changed much through time. And so the main takeaway of this study was that plate subduction must have started sometime prior to 3.5 billion years ago. So titanium is a very popular isotope system, so there's been a lot of papers that have been published since then, and this is another highlight of a paper. So previously, studies had focused on looking at rocks produced in island arc settings, so calc-alkaline rocks, and this study really expanded what had been measured, and so they focused here on rocks formed in plume settings, so places like Iceland and the Afar hotspot right here. And just by looking at the behavior of titanium with respect to MgO content for calc-alkaline rocks versus tholeiitic rocks, you can see that there's a really big change in the behavior of titanium, which should suggest that there's a change or a fractionation in the titanium isotope composition. Right? So tholeiitic, it's usually a dry magma. It can occur in all types of settings, but it's mostly found in plume environments. Calc-alkaline rocks are wet, and they're usually unique to convergent margin settings, places where you have subduction happening. Over here on the right-hand side, we have the titanium isotope data on the y-axis and silica content on the x-axis. And all of our island arc rocks are, I'm showing them right here. So they have this relatively muted titanium isotope fractionation until you reach more evolved compositions. And then the plume rocks are highlighted by this blue section right here. So the first thing you can notice is that the plume rocks, they fractionate titanium isotopes much more efficiently than the island arc rocks do. But if we're looking at shales, right, and we get an average shale titanium isotope composition of 0.6 per mil, and we try to reconstruct what the silica content of the crust was during that time period, if we plot a dashed line here, and we use plume rocks, the relationship of titanium and silica content for plume rocks, we would reconstruct a silica content of 60 weight%, whereas for island arc rocks, we would get something closer to 73 or 74 weight%. So the main takeaway from this study was that we can't use titanium isotopes alone in the detrital sediment record to determine the average silica content of the continental crust. All right, so another really exciting paper that was published recently, relatively recently by Liam Hoare, who will talk right after me, focused on rocks from all different types of settings. And so here, I'm sure you're getting sick of looking at this silica content versus titanium isotope composition here, but bear with me because I'm going to show it a lot more in this talk. Right, so here we have rocks from intraplate settings, alkaline, subalkaline, mid-ocean ridge settings, tholeiitic, and then subduction zone, calc-alkaline settings. So they're all color-coded here. The alkaline suites from intraplate settings in red, they show the most substantial isotope variation, and this magnitude of titanium isotope fractionation is controlled by the composition and the abundance of the iron and titanium oxides that are crystallizing out of the melt during magmatic differentiation. What was really exciting about this paper, I thought, was that the ARC suites show these titanium isotope paths that scale with redox state and water content. And another really cool thing or cool takeaway from this paper was that we could potentially use titanium isotopes now as a tracer for the geodynamic setting that the rock formed in, right? Because we have different behaviors of titanium isotope fractionation with magmatic differentiation. So returning to this question of, when did plate subduction begin, or when did felsic continental crust arise? I'm going to now, go further back in the rock record to the Acasta and Etowah gneiss. So, when did we go from the Hadean to the Earth that we're familiar with and know now today? So the Acasta and Etowah gneiss, we've already heard a couple of nice talks this morning about the Acasta gneiss, but I'm going to refer to the oldest rocks from the Acasta gneiss, the Etowah gneiss, which means ancient times. It's dated at 4.02 billion years old. This is the oldest known intact felsic crust fragment on Earth. It's thought to have formed in an intraplate plume setting. It's in the Slave Craton in Canada. This is like an Iceland-like setting where you have shallow level fractional crystallization of reduced and low water content basaltic magma. There's been a lot of previous work done on the Acasta gneiss complex. We saw earlier that the zircons are zoned, right? So they've had a really complex history, complex metamorphic history. The units have all been dated here, so we have dates ranging from about 4.03 to about 2.9 GA, right? And there's subsequent periods of magmatic activity. The zircons are complicated. They have multiple ages, overgrowths, and inclusions. And so these rocks have really been through the ringer in terms of, we're lucky that they're preserved, right? But we have to be really careful in interpreting them. But titanium, it's a high field strength element. It should be relatively immobile during metamorphism. And so this is a really good candidate for exploring the history of these rocks. So before I show the data from the Acasta gneiss, I want to bring us back to this familiar silica versus titanium isotope composition plot. And I've color-coded all of the modern rocks data that at the time of publication from this paper in 2020. Right, so in blue, we have our modern calc-alkaline rocks. In red, we have our modern intraplate tholeiitic rocks. In gray, we have our modern mid-ocean ridge basalt tholeiitic rocks. So island arc and plume here. All right, so our data from the Etowah and Acasta gneiss are now plotted on top of this, the modern data. So our Etowah gneiss are these gray circles right here, these 4.02 Etowah gneiss samples are plotting right on top of the trend defined by the modern interplate tholeiitic rocks, and then our younger than 3.94, so 3.75 GA and younger rocks are plotting on this trend defined by the modern calc-alkaline trend. So when we measured this data and looked at it, initially we thought, well, maybe we're capturing some transition here, right? So it looks like the oldest rocks, the 4 billion-year-old rocks, may have formed in a plume-like environment, similar to what Jesse Ramink had hypothesized in his papers, and that these younger rocks may have formed in a potentially in a subduction-like setting, right? And so we wanted to think a little bit more quantitatively about this data rather than just plotting isotope compositions on top of modern compositions. And so here we've defined the titanium isotope magmatic index. And so this is taking into account the titanium isotope composition and some geochemical characteristics of the rocks. So thinking about the silica content to the titanium content. And the benefit of using the log of the silica over titanium content versus titanium isotope composition is that these two magmatic series, these tholeiitic rocks and these calc-alkaline rocks, define two linear trends that can be fitted with a line, right? The slope of this line, of the segment between the rock and the convergence point, can provide a measure of how tholeiitic or how calc-alkaline a rock actually is, right? And so these slopes are different. Why would we want to do this? Well, now we can parameterize rocks. So instead of having to rely on classifying a suite of rocks, we can classify just one individual rock as long as we know its titanium isotope composition, its silica content, and titanium content. It works for evolved rocks, and it's relatively robust against weathering. So a lower TIMI, closer to 0.6, indicates a calc-alkaline trend, and a higher TIMI would indicate a tholeiitic trend. All right, so here I'm showing titanium isotope composition versus a log, SiO2 over TiO2. I have all of the modern samples plotted as these colored symbols in the background. These colored lines here are just melts models. So I started with a primitive tholeiitic and calc-alkaline composition and proceeded through magmatic differentiation. I looked at the phase proportions of what was crystallizing out of the melt and used fractionation factors to calculate what the titanium isotope composition would be. On the right-hand side, we're looking at the log of SiO2 over TiO2 versus TIMI. And our melts models are right here. All of our modern data is plotted here. And then these lines right here are indicating the average modern tholeiitic and average modern calc-alkaline TIMIs. So when we plot our old Idaho and Acasta gneiss samples on top of these lines, again, we see some really nice agreement between the 4 billion-year-old Idaho gneiss, right? It's plotting right on top of or very close to the trend defined by the modern tholeiitic rocks, and then our younger than 3.75 GA Acasta gneiss are plotting very closely to this modern calc-alkaline trend. I've also included some other data, some younger than 3.2 GA Barberton TTGs as these white diamonds right here, and I'll talk a little bit more about those later. So what does TIMI look like through time? So here we have our Hadean Idaho gneiss plotting right on top of the tholeiitic average, and then we see this transition towards more calc-alkaline TIMI averages, right? And so, at first glance, we would interpret this as a fundamental shift is happening in the way that these rocks were formed. These older rocks from 4GA were probably formed in a plume-like setting where you have dry fractional crystallization, and then these younger rocks, they're more similar to wet calc-alkaline magmas, and so maybe there's some process here that's introducing water into the melt, right? And so there were a lot of unanswered questions from this study. The door is not closed. We haven't, discovered when plate subduction started. There's this question of why do the post 3.74 GA Archean TTGs follow a trend defined by modern calc-alkaline rocks? So TTGs are formed by partial melting of wet metabasite at different depths. So there's this question, an important question of how does partial melting influence the titanium isotope composition? And further, we're plotting this age versus TIMI, right? We're looking at transitions in the formation mechanism of these rocks. But an important question is how widespread is this transition from tholeiitic to more calc-alkaline-like magmatism? So I'm going to next show some data that James Zhang, who is a PhD student at the University of Chicago, has generated. So this was kind of an extension of the Itawa and Acasta Gneiss project. He had a poster yesterday. He wasn't able to join, unfortunately, in person because of issues with getting a visa. But here we've expanded the number of measurements made on rocks from the Archean. And we've got some new data from the Pilbara and the Itzhak gneiss complex. So Pilbara, the rocks are about 3.3 GA. These rocks are thought to have formed in a dome and keel pattern consistent with vertical tectonics and the formation of TTGs by crustal thickening. And the Itzhak gneiss complex, these rocks range from about 3.8 to 3.6 GA. There are arc-like tholeiitic metabasalts and granitoids here. And some have argued that the formation of TTGs occurred by wet flux melting of wet ocean crust in a subduction zone setting. So it'll be really interesting to see what the titanium isotope compositions look like. All right, so the color scheme, I apologize, the color scheme is slightly changing here because this is now James's figures, but the modern data is still the same. So we have our modern tholeiitic rocks in red or pink, our modern calc-alkaline rocks in blue, and then all of our Archean or Hadean rocks are the colored symbols. So our 4 billion-year-old Itawa gneiss are still plotted right here. Our Acasta gneiss are kind of obscured by the new data. The Itzhak gneiss, or TTGs, are these red circles here. Now you have amphibolites and diorites down here. The Pilbara craton rocks are right here. And then I've also included the Kopval TTGs that were previously measured. So it's clear that the Archean granitoids, they define a clear correlation of titanium isotope composition versus silica content, and they fall on a similar trend as the younger than 3.75 GA Acasta gneiss samples, a trend that's defined by the modern calc-alkaline rocks formed in subduction zone settings. So the similarity between the Archean and modern arc rocks was first recognized with the Acasta gneiss study, but here we're really showing that the similarity extends to other cratons and TTGs formed under diverse settings. The other thing that you can notice is that if we zoom in on this section right here and look at the modern calc-alkaline trend, all of these Archean rocks are plotting slightly below the trend defined by modern calc-alkaline rocks. So you see a even more muted titanium isotope fractionation. All right, so another big question or another important question to think about is, what does this mean about the origin of these rocks? So can we actually distinguish between the effects of partial melting versus fractional crystallization? So to answer this question, James has done some thermodynamic based modeling to calculate phase proportions and major elemental compositions of different mineral assemblages at varying pressure and temperature paths. So he's done two different types of calculations. He's done a partial melting model using an enriched Archean tholeiitic protolith at 50, 75, and 100 degrees Celsius per kilobar. These are relevant, or thought to be relevant to TTG genesis. And then he's also done some equilibrium crystallization modeling for two tonalitic compositions at 6 kbar, which is relevant to crystallization or reworking of tonalite crust. Okay, So here I'm showing some of the results of his modeling data. So on the left-hand side, we have the partial melting scenario. So we have our starting basalt composition as this blue or green, I think blue star right here. And then these thick colored lines are the different temperature pressure paths for partial melting, right? And so at the beginning of partial melting, we're going to see a jump in the titanium isotope composition, right? And this makes sense. So the modeled melts are going to be enriched in the heavy titanium isotopes because a large portion of the titanium is going to remain in the residue. All of the major titanium-bearing residual minerals, they're going to host titanium in a higher coordination environment. So at the beginning of partial melting, we see these heavier titanium isotope compositions, and then as we proceed down, more and more melting, we move closer and closer to this starting basalt composition. The other thing that you can see is that we can actually fractionate titanium isotopes pretty substantially from partial melting. So we reach values here at about 5% that overlap with a lot of the tonolites that have been measured. So all of the symbols in the background are data from the Archean gneiss, Itzhak gneiss, Pilbara, and Kopfall. So our prediction for isotope fractionation for about 5% of partial melting, it largely overlaps with most tonolites that have been measured here. On the right-hand side, we're looking at fractional crystallization. So we have it for two different starting tonalite compositions, indicated by these pink stars right here. And then as we proceed through fractional crystallization, we reach progressively heavier and heavier titanium isotope compositions. Right? So we reach compositions that aren't yet possible or aren't possible through partial melting, right? And so some of this data is heavier, and partial melting really falls short of explaining the highest titanium isotope compositions that we see in this data set, from about 0.47 to about 0.57 per mil. Okay. James has remade this Timmy versus age figure, right? So, and here he's included the additional data. So the Itzhak gneiss in red, the Pilbara in blue right here, and yeah, the Kopfall TTGs are also included. But importantly, he's made some constraints on how fractional crystallization versus partial melting would influence the titanium isotope composition, but also the titanium isotope magmatic index, right? And so we know that partial melting can cause an increase in the titanium isotope composition, right? And so this envelope highlighted in yellow is showing this range in Timmy that we would expect for a partial melting scenario. But in order to reach higher Timmy values, we really have to invoke some fractional crystallization process. So, at first glance, when we're looking at our data and the results of the modeling, it seems to support this shift from dry fractional crystallization, like a tholeiitic style stage happening at about 4.02 GA, to a partial melting dominated regime with potentially, additional crustal reworking after about 3.94 GA. An important thing to note here is that so far, we've measured rocks from 4 different cratons ranging in age from about 2.98 to 4.02 GA, and we haven't detected another tholeiitic trend. So that's something that's kind of interesting about this data set. Okay, so to summarize, elevated titanium isotope compositions of these evolved granitoids from the Archean, obviously partial melting is involved, but there's some other process for the most elevated titanium isotope compositions that has to be invoked in order to explain those compositions. So these measurements and now the modeling show that this combination between the two, so partial melting and fractional crystallization, is what's needed to explain the full range of titanium isotope compositions of these TTGs from the Archean. This fractional crystallization that I keep talking about, it's important to note that it could happen during TTG melt ascent, or it could be something happening during the reworking of older crust. So with that, I would like to thank everyone for their attention.
Thank you very much, Sarah. We have time for a few questions.
Thank you very much for a great talk, Sarah, and congratulations on the award. I wanted to ask you, often, with these really, really silicic granitoids, intrusive rocks, people often think that they're intruded as kind of more like crystal mushes and that you might have challenges in segregating melt from silicate phases. And I was wondering if you could maybe comment on the challenges with dealing with that and interpreting titanium isotope data.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, I feel like as far as I can think of, it's titanium isotopes. It's like I said, it could be, it's a process that could, the fractionation that we see with the TTGs could be during melt ascent, or it could be during fractional crystallization. So yeah, thinking about that a little bit more would be important in order to kind of get at more of the formation mechanism of the TTGs.
Yeah, thanks very much. Very convincing arguments for calc-alkaline volcanism, magmatism after 3.9. But what about the older ones? If you look at the Jack Hill zircons or the Babton old zircons, they fall on a very distinctive trend, which is best interpreted as repeated melting of a mafic source with mafic composition over a period of about 400 million years, which to me looks more like melting in a stagnant lid situation, within the lid, in situ melting within the lid. And it's not really comparable, at least in the way I see it, with something like Iceland, an Iceland plume-related situation.
Yeah, so the 4.02 GA Itaewon ice, I should have said earlier that they have a very different rare earth element and trace element composition. And when you compare them to modern rocks, they're most geochemically similar to Icelandites. So that's why they're interpreted to have formed in that type of environment. Yeah.
Sure, but this was the Hadean. There's no, any comparison is probably open to interpretation.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the further back in time, it's really tricky and a little dangerous to compare to modern samples, and it's kind of like apples to oranges for sure.
Thank you, Sarah. So the original classification of tholeiitic and calc-alkaline series is based on the behavior of iron, such that I think the calc-alkaline is more iron depleted and the tholeiitic is slightly more iron enriched in the evolved conditions. But so have you really looked at the iron depletion signatures in your samples?
Just like looking at the trace element composition of the samples?
No, iron.
Yeah, iron. Yeah, for sure. So the samples that are plotting, the Itaewon gneiss samples that are plotting on the trend from the modern tholeiitic rocks, they're iron depleted. Yeah, so they follow trends. If you plot on an AFM diagram, they look very similar to modern tholeiitic rocks.
So do you really see a transition in iron signatures or iron depletion signatures in your cast samples?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Can you comment on the role of garnet in controlling titanium isotopic variations?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so maybe Liam will talk a little bit more about, yeah, I guess, are you asking like how does titanium partition into garnet, or whether or not we can use garnet? Yeah, can you elaborate a little bit more? Yeah, so I don't recall off the top of my head about the fractionation factor for garnet, but yeah, I think most of the minerals that we're looking at, I mean, I have to go back to James's poster a little bit more to look at the mineral phase diagrams, but I don't think that garnet is playing a huge role in the titanium isotope fractionation. Yeah, it's mostly like the iron oxides that are driving the fractionation.
Hey, Sarah, cool stuff about titanium isotopes. So I wanted to go back to the castagnesis because I agree with you, there's a transition, but I think it occurred much earlier. It's just a sampling bias, because with silicon isotopes, we showed pretty much the same thing with the distinction between calc-alkaline magmas and tholeiitic magmas. And there are samples that are 3.96 billion year old that have typical TTG signatures, which means that this transition did occur, but much earlier. And if I'm right, you said that you haven't found any tholeiitic differentiation trends later, which actually this is not true in every single craton. We have this, what we call these diuretic gneisses that have this specific composition with very flat rare earth patterns. Ellis Hoffman showed this in the castagneis complex, in the ancient gneiss complex. You see that in Barberton, we see that in India, in many places. So I guess this is pretty much like due to the sampling you had.
Yeah, definitely. So an important thing to note is that I meant to say this in the talk, but when you look at the map of the castagneis, it's really like a postage stamp on Earth, yeah. Right? So it's a really small portion of crust that's exposed. So whatever we're gleaning from these rocks is, we have to be really careful in interpreting what it means globally for what was happening. And then to your other question, so yes, I mean, we could have seen a transition happening.
Yeah, we have to move on, sorry.
Yeah, and then the other question, sorry, really quick. I meant to say that we haven't seen the titanium, in the titanium isotope record, we haven't seen the tholeiitic trend show up again.
I would like to thank you, Sarah, again.